The last major theatre of revolution in 1848 was in Italy. Italy was a little bit like Germany in that it was today. Obviously, there's a united single Italian country. Italy was quite politically divided in 1848. You had some independent Italian kingdoms, Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia in northwest Italy, the Kingdom of Naples, or sometimes known as the Kingdom of Two Sicilies in the south, were independent Italian kingdoms. Austria ruled large parts of northern Italy, and in the centre of Italy, you had the Papal States governed by the Pope. And so there was a kind of combination of different rebellions against different forces in these different Italian kingdoms. So, as in Austria and Germany, news of the revolution in France spread to Italy by March 1848, and it sparked riots. Initially, it sparked riots in the parts of Italy that were controlled by the Austrians, especially Milan and Venice. Riots broke out, and in both Milan and Venice, essentially the Austrian army was chased out of the city by people who were unhappy with the economic conditions as they existed under Austrian rule. So what we have is, as in Germany, as in Austria, we have various different groups that want various different things. The liberals in the various Italian city-states want liberal reform. Some of them also want to unify Italy into a single state. The question, of course, would be what exactly kind of state would a united Italy be? Liberals tended to support constitutional monarchy. In particular, they looked to the King of Piedmont, Sardinia, that is the wealthiest city or wealthiest kingdom in Italy. The King of Piedmont, Sardinia was Charles Albert, and they wanted him to unite Italy and make it a more liberal, make Italy a united constitutional monarchy. But traditionally, Italian nationalism had been supported by republicanism. We met Giuseppe Mazzini in an earlier class. And Mazzini had been a Republican. His Young Italy movement had encouraged the creation of a unified Italian republic. Nevertheless, for practical purposes, many Italian nationalists, including Mazzini himself, looked to Charles Albert of Piedmont, Sardinia, to attack the Austrians, and they managed to persuade the king to do so. So, in the spring of 1848, Piedmont, Sardinia launches an offensive against the Austrian territories of Lombardy and Venetia, governed from Milan and Venice, in an effort to bring about a unified Italy. Or at least that is what Italian nationalists hoped. Many people privately worried that perhaps Charles Albert was only trying to extend the size of his own kingdom rather than really bring about a truly unified Italy. Another figure whom nationalists looked to as a potential source of unification was Pope Pius IX. Pius had only recently become Pope in Rome. He had introduced some very minor liberal reforms. He had freed some liberals who'd been imprisoned under his predecessor. And some people hoped that perhaps he would be more of a liberal ruler that could, around which the entire Italian peninsula could be unified. Charles Albert quickly found that his army, after some initial success against the Austrians, essentially were defeated. So the Piedmont Sardinians were no longer going to be the source of unifying Italy into one single kingdom, and actually it quickly became apparent as well that Pius IX, the Pope, was not as liberal as people hoped. So the Charles Albert of Piedmont, Sardinia was more or less defeated by the summer of 1848. In November of 1848, there were popular demonstrations in Rome demanding that Pius IX introduced more of a liberal government. He did so, he agreed to do so, but felt he was under duress, so he appointed liberals and Republicans to create a government in Rome, the government for the Papal States. But Pius himself felt that this was far too radical, far too liberal for his liking, and fearing for his political future, he fled the city in November of 1848. In November of 1849, in February of 1849, the Papal States essentially declared themselves to be a Roman Republic. And for a few months, Rome existed as an independent republic on the Italian peninsula. Traditionally, the defender of the Pope in the Papal States was the Habsburgs, the Austrian Empire. They obviously were dealing with their own problems in 1849, especially with a revolution in Hungary. And so instead, it was left to the French to help defend and restore the Pope. You might wonder, why would the French get themselves involved? Well, if you remember, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte is now in charge in France as president. He decides it would look good for his rule to put the Pope back in charge in the Papal States. That would win the support of conservative French Catholics. And so French troops land in Italy in the spring of 1849 to try and defeat the Republic. And by July of 1849, the Republican forces have been defeated by the French army, and Pius's rule is restored in Italy. So, as elsewhere, we have liberals and nationalists and Republicans looking for various changes, but in the end, the status quo is largely maintained in Italy as well. And so, overall, what were the consequences of the Revolution of 1848? Well, firstly, Europe was badly shaken by revolutions, but really the only place we saw substantial political change was in France. In France, the monarchy was overthrown. It was replaced by a republic, although, as we saw, by the end, that republic had come under the control of moderate conservative forces, maybe not quite as radical and as liberal as the people who brought about its existence were hoping for. Revolution had been defeated in both Germany and Italy, but for a moment it had seemed that possible that both Italy and Germany would be united as single nation states, and that had kind of kindled a passion for nationalism in both countries that eventually would be realised. In fact, it wouldn't be very, very long before Italy and Germany were to emerge as independent states, or as United States, and that essentially was following on from the impetus created in 1848. The middle class of Europe still remained liberal, still wanted liberal reforms, but they became far more suspicious of revolts. Basically, the lessons that liberals took from 1848 was that revolution was dangerous because liberals could not control it. If liberals started a revolt or a revolution to bring about liberal change, it was quite possible, indeed quite likely, that radical socialists, communists, Republicans, whatever it is, would piggyback on their movement and create an even more radical revolution than liberals were comfortable with, a revolution that might possibly threaten private property. And of course, remember at the very beginning of this class, I mentioned Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, preaching the abolition of private property. So for middle-class liberals, revolution kind of lost its shine or its appeal after 1848. Conservatives remained in power across Europe, but they realized that essentially they were sitting on a volcano, and they had suppressed the revolutions of 1848, but they could no longer expect the status quo to remain without making some kind of changes and concessions to liberals. And in particular, what conservatives began to realize was that nationalism and mass politics could be a way in which liberal reforms or Republican or communist reforms could be threatened, headed off. So the lesson for conservatives was that nationalism in particular could serve as a rallying cry to preserve traditional society in the face of demands for liberal, Republican or socialist reform. And so 1848 marks the beginning point in which nationalism shifts from being a force associated with democracy and the political left towards one that will be embraced by the conservative political right. And we'll see in our next class, when we talk about the unification of Italy and Germany, that it is actually conservative powers that use nationalism not only to unify these countries, but also to preserve the political status quo.